James Fox. I'm the Global Chief Strategy Officer at MullenLowe Group, and it is a great privilege to be here today presenting to you at the Central St. Martin's Graduate Showcase. Over the next hour, I want to talk to you about the 2020s, how this decade is going to look and how it's going to turn out. The truth is, I think if we could have a reset button on this year, we probably would take it. It's been a very difficult start to this decade, but sometimes out of difficulty can grow innovation. We can get better as a planet and as a society, and I'm hoping that's the case here today. Now, the 20s tend to be quite interesting periods in history. If you go back 3 centuries to the 1720s, that was the birth of the modern day corporation, which was enabled by superior maritime technology. We had boats that could move things across the ocean, and really the birth of consumerism. 1820s were a very exciting time to be alive. The world effectively shrinks as we get mass transportation like trains, but also typewriters, telegraphs, photography. So big seismic changes there. And the 1920s really defined a lot of what we consider modern popular culture, whether that's the invention of the album or the art form of film or Art Deco. A lot of those cultural assets that were created in the 20s have continued to resonate with us today. Now, obviously, we don't live out history every decade repeating itself. But we do hear echoes in history. And we're certainly starting to hear a lot of those echoes today. I think probably the biggest rhyme that we're hearing right now is the pandemic rhyme. It was almost 100 years ago that the Spanish flu killed 50 million people and had many of the effects that it's having on societies today, putting emphasis on healthcare systems and socialized healthcare systems, dealing with distancing and quarantining. Imagine doing that without Netflix or the internet. And then also all the inequality that gets exposed when a pandemic hits the world creates a sense of activism in people. And I think we're starting to see echoes of that as well. And I'll come on to talk about that in just a second. Now, I work in advertising, so I'm very used to putting disclaimers on ads. And this slide here is my disclaimer. It's simply not possible to predict the future. If you could, you would most likely be on a yacht in the Bahamas somewhere, having made a lot of money. No one can predict the future, but what we can do is we can look at past events. We can look through the rearview mirror and look for patterns of change in the world that will directionally show us where the world may be progressing. So it's a bit like driving with kind of the windshield totally covered and just using the mirror. You can do it. It's probably not a very good idea, and you should certainly wear a seatbelt. So for this presentation, please put on the seatbelts, because there may be some things that we get right and there may be some things that we get wrong. Now, looking back to that rearview mirror, I want to go back about 61 years ago to 1959. And this gentleman here, Gordon Moore. Gordon Moore was one of the 3 founders of Intel. He's probably the best known one because he invented a law that was predictive and has been true for the last 61 years. So he predicted that the number of transistors you can put onto a silicon chip will double every 2 years. And not only that, the size of the chip will halve every year. And if you chart out the history of Intel, the history of silicon chips, you'll find that that's still true today. That is an exponential growth curve. And in fact, Intel's entire business model is built on it. Every 2 years, they double the number of transistors, and every year in between, they halve the size of the chip. And I think they're down to 14 nanometers now. Now, I'm not so interested in talking to you about the technicalities of semiconductors. I'm interested in talking to you about the mathematical idea behind doubling, which is exponential or compound growth. Exponential growth is probably one of the most powerful forces in mathematics and in physics. And just to demonstrate how powerful exponential growth is, I'm going to give you a parable. So I don't think this is a true story, but it tells a point. So the game of chess was invented in China in the 6th century, and it was a global smash. People loved it. And it was particularly big in India. So as the story goes, the Emperor of India invites the inventor of chess to come to his palace so that he can congratulate him and reward him. The inventor of chess comes, the Emperor says, "Great job on chess, we love it, it's a smash. I'll give you any reward you want, anything in the world." And the inventor of chess says, "Well, I'm a very simple man. I just want rice. If you could just put 1 grain of rice on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc., etc. And then I just want all the rice that's left at the end." So the emperor says, "Okay, let me just go talk to my court mathematician." And he wanders out and he says, "This guy's crazy. I would have given him a palace. I would have given him whatever he asked for. And he's just asked for some rice." So he asks the mathematician, "Just figure out how much rice we owe this guy." This is the answer. It's a 9 with 19 digits after. It's more rice than the world could ever produce. It's more rice that could ever be stored on the planet. And that is the power of exponential growth. Now, why am I talking to you about this? Well, there are 64 squares on a chessboard. Gordon Moore's law was about 61 years ago. So we're now getting to the end of this chessboard when it comes to the digitalization and the computational power that we have available to us. And this is a very, very large number, and it's going to have enormous change and implications for us all. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means for us and how we work and how we go about life moving forward. In 1993, the science fiction writer William Gibson said the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed in Wired magazine. And what he meant was the building blocks of the future were already there. So computational power, digitization, but only a few people had access to them and not that much. Well, things change very quickly when you're on an exponential growth curve like Moore's law. And I would argue that the future is here, and right now it is evenly distributed. And that means, well, it has huge implications for all parts of our life, and that's what I want to talk about really today. So I'm going to start by talking about technology and some of the technologies that I think we should be aware of as we move forward in our careers and in our lives. There's an author called Chris Steiner who wrote a book called Automate This, and he says that in the 2020s, there's going to be a divide, and the divide will be between those who can write algorithms and those who are controlled by them. And he thinks this divide is as big a divide as people who are literate today and people who are illiterate. Now, this sounds like quite a grandiose statement by someone who wants to sell a book, but I think there's quite a lot of truth to it. Now, algorithms are everywhere. An algorithm is simply a set of instructions, of mathematical processes to get to an answer. And I think we're all very familiar with them. So, you know, Facebook has an algorithm that determines what social posts we should see. Amazon has an algorithm that determines what products we should be presented with. Voice activation like Siri or Alexa all use algorithmic powers. Netflix helps us choose our media choices. So we're quite familiar with algorithms at the moment. And I think one of the most curious things is that love is probably the most human of all emotions. To love someone and to be loved is fundamental to a lot of people and their lives. Yet it's one of the first things we've outsourced to algorithms. So at the moment, 31% of all marriages in the US started online. And by the end of the decade, that number is projected to go up to 51%. So more than half of us. Now, the reason we do this is because the old system wasn't as it. So you would have to go to a bar and see somebody you liked and then get the courage to approach them, and perhaps you were compatible and perhaps you weren't. And of course, the computer doesn't worry about any of that stuff. It has a huge data set from which it can start to match and see what's successful and what isn't. So we're very quick to outsource algorithms to the most important parts of our lives. Now, algorithms are very interesting and dangerous in some ways because they're predictive. There are very few predictive models that work. That's why Moore's law is so exciting and well known. It's because it's a prediction that has come true. Quite a few years ago, I think 5 years ago, there was a professor at the University of Wisconsin called Mike Kaczynski who developed an algorithm that could see whether or not it knew you better than a colleague or a friend or a spouse. So it got you to, it fed in the number of likes, a certain number of likes into the computer. And based on that, you would take a questionnaire and then a friend or a colleague would then try and guess what your answers were. So this algorithm, just by getting 10 likes, would know you better than a colleague. It would score better on the questionnaire than a colleague could, predicting your responses. 70 likes better than a friend or a roommate, 150 likes better than a family member, 300 likes better than a spouse. Now, just to give you some context, Facebook has over 1 trillion likes since it started. So it is sitting on a treasure trove of data, which could be predictive. And I think it's one of the reasons why people are getting very nervous about large corporations having access, such exclusive access to these large data sets. The algorithm was 95% accurate in predicting your ethnicity, 93% accurate in predicting your gender, 88% accurate in determining your sexuality, and 85% accurate in determining your political party. And I think if you've lived through Brexit or you've lived through the US elections, you'll understand just how dangerous it can be to be able to accurately predict someone's political affiliations so that you could send them targeted messages that either amplify their hopes or prey on their fears in order to swing quite a tight election. It's been weaponized, it's been used, and it's now part of life. We always think of algorithms as something scientific and something non-human, but actually humans write algorithms. And so biases get built into algorithms. The most obvious one being a gender bias. So 95% of all leadership positions in the tech industry are held by men, which is a shocking statistic. If you go all the way down the chain to developers, engineers, programmers, India has the most female programmers at 20%, so it's still 80% male. I think Chile has the lowest at around 3%. But from top to bottom, this is a male-dominated industry, which leads to issues like these. So women are less likely than men to be shown ads for highly paid jobs on Google. Software that assesses recidivism. So recidivism is your propensity to commit a crime once you've been released from jail. The software was twice as likely to mistakenly flag Black defendants as opposed to white defendants. Now, I should say that parole boards and judges don't use algorithms. However, police do use algorithms to determine where they should put their resource. And you have to believe there's going to be some bias in those algorithms. If you do a Google image search for CEOs, you get 11% will be women when the reality is 27% of all US CEOs are women. And so algorithms are very useful. They're predictive, but because of their power, they can also be quite dangerous unless we know what we're doing with them. I think a lot of us have heard about automation, that the robots are coming after our job, and certainly that's going to be a big theme of this next decade. It's predicted that by 2030, almost 1 billion people could lose their job to automation, which is a large number. And I think what's interesting is we seem to accept that factory workers automatically goes to machines, but actually it's white collar jobs that are going to be really obliterated by automation. So there's a guy called Kai-Fu Lee, who's an amazing speaker. He used to run Google in China. He now has his own venture capital fund in Singapore. But his thesis is that white collar jobs are going to get decimated, that that computers are much better at routine accountancy, law, whatever it may be, than humans are. And actually, I was in Singapore last year and I was speaking to the head of HR. They had done a test with all their corporate lawyers where they'd given them a contract that had some mistakes in it. And they asked them to go and find those mistakes. It took them roughly 3 days and they got about an 80% accuracy rate. They gave it to an AI machine. It came back in 2 hours and it had a 98% accuracy rate. So anyone that's thinking of getting into corporate law, you may want to think again. That said, for blue collar jobs, it doesn't look that good either. So actually 47% of all jobs in the US are at high risk of takeover. If you're thinking of getting into any of these professions, or we want your children to, I would think again. So there aren't going to be cashiers, there aren't going to be a lot of chefs, there aren't going to be a lot of waiters or bus drivers or construction workers as these industries become automated. But that's not the really disruptive technological force that I think is going to affect all of us in the next 10 years. The big disruptive force coming from technology is going to be machine learning or artificial intelligence. So to give you an example of this, this is Garry Kasparov. He was one of the world's greatest chess grandmasters. He was world champion. And for a long time, the holy grail of artificial intelligence was, can we beat a human grandmaster at chess? Because that's the pinnacle of intellectual human achievement. And if a computer can beat it, then we've kind of won the war. So as you probably are aware, IBM created a computer called Deep Blue. And what they did is they effectively just stuffed it full of knowledge. They gave it almost every game that's ever been played, that's ever been recorded, and taught it what's the best possible move for any particular position. And then they put it up against Garry Kasparov. Now, Garry Kasparov has a biological computer in his head called his brain, and he also has an enormous memory for games, but the computer turned out to have a better memory and it beat him. But it's actually another game that is where things start to get very interesting. So I don't know if you're familiar with the game of Go. It's the world's oldest board game. It's a very simple game. You just put down white or black pebbles onto a board, but it's also enormously complicated because the number of squares on the board are much bigger than a chessboard. So the number of possible moves in Go are greater than the number of atoms in the universe. So not atoms in the world, not atoms in the galaxy, but in the universe. So there isn't a computer big enough in the world, or the universe indeed, to be able to outthink a human in that sense. So this has always been the kind of the new holy grail. Can we get a machine to beat the world's best Go player? And not so long ago, a group called DeepMind, who are part of Google, used machine learning to see whether or not they could do this. It's actually a documentary on Netflix. I highly recommend it. It's called AlphaGo, and it's well worth watching. But effectively, what they did was they taught the machine how to teach itself to play Go, because they couldn't possibly teach it all the permutations. And then they put it up against the world's greatest Go player. And this guy is called Lee Sedok. He's South Korean. And he's not just the best Go player at the moment. He is probably the greatest Go player of all time. He's the Michael Jordan, the Roger Federer of Go. And they had a 5-game competition that was broadcast all over the world. And poor old Lee Sedol was beaten 4 times and he won once. But what was so incredible about this was, I think it was in game 3, they were about move 65, which is quite early in the game of Go, where the computer played what looked like an error. And the entire audience gasped. You see all the programmers just clasping their heads. Something has obviously gone very, very badly wrong. And Lee Sedol starts to perk up and he starts to move faster. Well, it turns out 300 moves later that move on move 65 was the winning move. And no one had ever thought of that move before. No one could understand it at the time. And that meant that the computer showed originality of thought, creative thinking, which to me is about as exciting as being able to put a man on the moon. It's an extraordinary thing. And we are just touching the surface of this technology. It's starting to be applied across different industries, but it will certainly be something to look at moving forward. Just a small point. Poor old Lee Sedol, he actually quit because he got beaten by the machine. He said, if I'm not, even if I'm at the top of all the human rankings, I can never be #1. So I'm not going to play anymore. And it is amazing to watch him almost be psychologically destroyed by the fact that the computer just was able to outthink him every single time. So AI is definitely changing the world. It's probably going to change the world for the better. We're already seeing it being used in medical diagnosis, where doctors can now often predict medical events 48 hours before they occur, based on a computer having access to hundreds of thousands of data sets that can predict those kinds of things. And PwC is actually going to increase global GDP by 14% by 2030. So that's not an insignificant number. That's $15 trillion. So what are we going to do with this money? And I think you'll start to hear, or you may have already started to hear, politicians talking about universal basic income, with the idea being that all this money that is saved through AI and all the number of jobs that are being lost through automation, you could combine those two problems or two solutions, and you could just give people money for being human, for being themselves. Now, some economists think this is a terrible idea. It's a disincentive to work. Other economists think it's an amazing idea, but it's being trialed. It's being trialed in 6 major countries. There's another 4 on the way. And actually COVID-19 is creating a form of universal basic income, because banks are simply printing more money to give debt relief to people that can no longer work. So we're kind of sitting through a universal basic income experiment, and it'll be very interesting to see where that moves forward to. Now, I know being all part of Central School of St. Martin's, you are creative people, you are artists and illustrators and just creative minds. And I think there's a feeling that we're all safe, you know, if we work in advertising or marketing, because it's a creative industry. And that's the one thing computers can't do. But I'm afraid I'm going to disabuse you of that notion a little bit. So the first AI painted picture sold at Christie's last year for $423,000. Now this may be just a stupid millionaire that just will spend their money on whatever they want, but it's hard to argue with that. And I think it has huge implications for art and what is the artist's intent, and how important is that when it comes to appreciating a painting or a sculpture. If you ever get bored, just go to Bot or Not. I think it's www.bot-or-not. It will introduce you to a stanza of poetry, and you have to guess whether a robot wrote it or whether or not a human wrote it. And I guarantee you, it's like flipping a coin. There is no way of knowing. They're near identical. You'll get 50-50 every time. And even in my industry in advertising, AI is writing advertisements. In Saatchi & Saatchi in Tokyo gave a poor computer all the instructions on how to write an advert for Lexus, for a luxury car. So they fed it all the competitive advertising, they fed it all the brand guidelines, and it actually wrote a pretty decent script that they shot. It wasn't an amazing ad, but you certainly wouldn't know it wasn't written by a human. McCann in Singapore did a similar thing. They actually got a piece of machine learning that could write headlines, and they got real human copywriters to each write headlines for a new mint, Clorets. And then they took those ideas to the client, but didn't tell them which was human and which was computer. And the client actually chose the computer ideas. It then went to an awards jury, and the awards jury also chose the computer ideas. So it's not a stretch to see how AI may start to take over, certainly in the advertising and marketing business. Now, this is a headline from Adweek. Millward Brown, which is the company that judges the effectiveness of advertising for big companies, says here, officially confirms AI written ads 25% more effective than human written ads. Now, this isn't a real headline. I made this up. I just photoshopped this in. But I do believe this is a headline we will be seeing this decade, because in the same reason that Gary Kasparov can only keep so many number of games in his biological brain, it's the same with people that work in advertising. Now, if you have a computer that has access to data sets, that understands exactly who they're targeting, what their attitudes are, what their buying behavior is, obviously, and you can A/B test in seconds, the machine written ones will be better because a human copywriter doesn't have access to those skills. So things are going to change quite rapidly in the creative industries. I think the entire business model of advertising could be up for grabs, and I apologize for such a sort of poorly designed slide, but I was reading this book on a plane, and I literally just took a picture of it on my phone. It's by an Israeli historian called Yuval Noah Harari, who's an amazing futurologist. I'll just read out the main parts to you. He said, actually, the new model is based on transferring authority from humans to algorithms, including the authority to choose and buy things. Once algorithms choose and buy things for us, the traditional ad industry will go bust. Consider Google. Google wants to reach a point where it can ask anything and get the best answer in the world. So if you want to know what car you should buy, you know what my needs are, you know how many people in my household, you even know my politics, how I feel about climate change. What's the best car for me? If Google gives us a good answer to that, and we learn to experience, to trust that algorithm instead of our very own easily manipulated feelings, why would you bother with car advertising? So you may think, well, this is crazy and I would never buy a car just based on what Google tells me. But don't forget, we already outsource our relationships to computers because it is a better system. I don't think any of us would have dreamed that we would let our smartphones navigate for us all around the world. But it's simply a better system than using a map and having an argument with your spouse in the car about which direction you should have taken. So this could be the end of the advertising industry. The next piece of technology I want to talk about is the decentralized internet. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I do think it's worth talking about because it's going to get a lot more traction as we move forward through this decade. To understand the decentralized internet, you kind of have to understand the evolution of the web. So Web 1.0, the Wild West, the early days, in the sort of early 90s, mid 90s, was all about how do we attract as many users as we possibly can, because there's a network effect. The more people on the internet, the more powerful the internet became. And so companies would find pieces of utility that could only be supplied by the internet in order to draw and get a monopoly on people coming in, like email. The web became a very crowded, difficult to navigate place as a result of this, because everyone was trying to pull in users. So Web 2.0 was much more about centralization. How can we create hubs where people can go very simply and easily to check out their social information, to check out their professional information, to check out their news information, or whatever it may be. And we got these huge conglomerates in Silicon Valley that effectively are sitting on and owning all this data, which I think politicians and the public are just starting to realize is quite a dangerous thing. Now, technologists are fighting back against this using decentralization. So rather than allowing all the world's information to sit on data servers in Silicon Valley or in the Arizona desert somewhere, decentralization will mean the internet sits on everybody's computer and will be verified by everyone's computer, and the information will belong to everybody. Cryptocurrency is a version of this, but blockchain technology on which decentralization is built is really about taking away the control that large corporations have on our information. Right now, blockchain technology is being used by a lot of our clients, but not really as currency at this point, but for things like supply chain management. So knowing where the diamond came from, that it came from the proper mine, that it's conflict-free, quality assurance, accounting, smart contracts, anything that just requires you to trust the other person, but doesn't require a lot of thought. Blockchain is definitely the answer for that. In the UK, they're using it to, or they're using a pilot at the moment to see how evidence is handled in court, because obviously that's something that you really, really want to make sure no one can get their hands on, that it's absolutely untouchable, and blockchain allows you to do that. Estonia is effectively the poster child for blockchain. They've built an entire citizen identity management system using blockchain, and they're building it into a lot of their laws. Rather than have an ID number that can be stolen or a social security number that can be stolen, you're given your own blockchain PIN, which is almost impossible to steal or forge, which holds your digital identity. It can hold your health records. It can hold pretty much anything you want it to. And I think that is the direction we're moving in. Cryptocurrencies I want to touch on just for a second, because I do believe we are going to enter a world where Bitcoin, Ethereum, or whatever cryptocurrency becomes the dominant mechanism will certainly be prevalent before the end of the decade. Bitcoin is an application that sits on top of blockchain. And because blockchain is basically a ledger system, which allows you to understand what's going in and what's going out, and nobody can tamper with it, it's actually very good for creating currency, because that's what banks do. Banks operate a ledger system at the most basic level. Crypto has a lot of advantages. So counterfeiting is not a problem with blockchain. Identity theft is less of a problem. Money can move instantly. Now, if you live in, let's say, for instance, you live in Saudi Arabia, or you live in China, or you live in a repressive regime where you want to leave, but you also want to take your money out. Most regimes can block your bank accounts. Now, if you have if your money is in crypto, all you need is an 8-word phrase in your brain to take all that money across the border without ever having to report it or tell the government anything about it. Access. So 2.2 billion individuals are connected to the internet but don't have access to banking. So blockchain is perfect for that. And then, of course, fees. Banks make their money by charging fees for allowing you to move your money from one place to another. They borrow your money and they invest it. That's not how cryptocurrencies work. Miners have to use computational power and they get rewarded for doing so. So we don't know what the future of crypto is going to be. If I had to put a bet, I would put a very big bet on Ethereum rather than blockchain. But one thing I do know is that finance is a little bit like water. It will always trickle down and find the easiest path. So we went from gold being currency to gold coins, to coins that looked like they were gold but represented gold that was kept in a vault, to notes, to checks, to digital wallets. So I think crypto is very likely to come up over the next 10 years. Okay, demographics. So that's the technology bit over. And again, I wouldn't worry too much about automation and AI coming in and kind of taking over jobs. World always changes. Things are never static, and new industries always are created as a result of innovation. I think a lot of the drudgery of work will be taken out by some of these things. So next on to just what are the demographic changes we're going to see over the 2020s, because demographics are something we can predict quite well, quite accurately based on population numbers. So let's start with Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on which side of the ocean you live on. I've been in New York for 20 years now, so I'm going to call them Gen Z, so I apologize for that. 36% of the total global population, so they're a massive, massive group, 1.86 billion globally. This is a really interesting generation in that they've grown up through enormous economic instability. By the way, the definition of Gen Z is anyone aged 5 to 25. So if you're 5 to 25, you're Gen Z. They've had a lot of social change and very rapid digitalization. And generations are defined by rapid social change. Why are we interested in them? Well, as you know, in advertising, we're very interested in them because they're already the biggest consumer spending group in the world. So understanding what they want and understanding their needs and how we can better fulfill those needs for them is critical for any business to survive today. In some ways, Gen Z are quite paradoxical in that they're both very conservative, but also quite liberal. So socially liberal, financially conservative. Why are they financially conservative? Because they've lived through one recession in 2008, and they're about to live through, unfortunately, another recession, which is bound to come over the coming months and years. Why are they so socially liberal? Well, they're more diverse than any other generation in terms of ethnicity. In the US, Gen Z are the first majority non-Caucasian generation. And that diversity is a very powerful thing. I think one of the areas where a lot of people didn't get right was that one of the flashpoints between generations was going to be around gender. I don't think anyone predicted that what Gen X and what baby boomers and millennials think about gender is so different from what Gen Z does. But Gen Z really believes that gender is a spectrum and that you can fall anywhere on that spectrum at any given time. And I think a lot of older people believe that gender is, it's binary. It's one thing or another. There's no in between. Because of that, very high support of LGBTQ rights, and only a third of teens today, a third of teens today identify as something other than heterosexual. So I think just in simple marketing terms, we often look at kind of sexuality and gender. I think all of those things are changing, and our understanding of them has to change in order to properly connect with this new generation. I want to talk a little bit about activism because I think it's a very important thing that's going on today. Gen Z are absolutely at the forefront of activism for a whole bunch of reasons. The main reason is social media has really kind of made the world much smaller. It used to be that we could be broadcast to by a very small section of corporations, movie studios, newspaper owners, television networks. Now we can broadcast ourselves to the world, and we can draw attention to different issues. And it's very, very, very quick. And so that allows activism to happen much, much faster. I think the other thing is Gen Z are having a very rough time, and there is a lot of inequality and social, a lack of social justice in the world. And they are really stepping up to try and create a better world for themselves, partly because they have to, particularly if you look at things like climate change. You know, it's an issue that will affect them more than it'll affect the older generation. You know, I always like to look at Time magazine covers because it kind of gives you a little hint of the zeitgeist. It's interesting to see activists right on the front cover there. So you've got the kids from Parkland, Florida, who did arguably more for gun rights safety and more for changing the national discourse on gun rights than any other social or any other activist group has ever done, with a media budget of $0. Whether it's the Me Too activists or whether it's Black Lives Matter, these things are now getting mainstream traction, but it's all coming from the ground up, not the top down. The role for social media is actually morphing. It used to be kind of social in the sense of my friends and what am I doing and where am I going, and here's a picture of a funny kitten. It's actually now moving into a different sense of the word social, a civic sense. So almost half of all Americans have used social media for a civic activity, which is really great to kind of show their passion for a cause or to encourage people to look more carefully into a political or social justice issue. Most people agree that social media really does give a voice to the underrepresented. And platforms that weren't designed for social activism are being used for social activism. So Snapchat is really, it's transitory, it doesn't last very long. So it's great for telling people where they should come out for marches without necessarily having all the police and the government knowing at the same time. So I think the world is really kind of getting smaller, and what was once local news becomes global. So if you look at what happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis, that could have been a local story, but it instantly became a global story. And what once seemed very distant, like a problem in Minneapolis, a policing issue in Minneapolis, now feels intensely personal to people from all sorts of different cultures all around the world. I did want to draw attention to Black Lives Matter because I think, one, it's an incredibly important topic. It's not just about police brutality, it's about enormous inequality in healthcare, in education, in finance. But I think what's so interesting about it is it really started as something quite small and something that was seen as almost inappropriate. So the NFL, for instance, in 2018, they said any player caught kneeling during the national anthem will be thrown out. Now, of course, they've come around very, very quickly, and now they're saying everyone's allowed to kneel. And it was really nice watching the Premier League, seeing that all, not just the players, but the coaches and the referees all kneeling against this matter. And it's interesting how quickly this movement spread around the world. So over 60 countries have had major marches, people with, I think, more than 100,000 people in them, taking this idea of social injustice and police brutality and bringing light to it and creating meaningful change. So I think, the positive news is that activists and young people really have the power now to grab hold of their societies, grab hold of their politicians, and start dragging them into the future. I think one of the big issues we have is that our politicians are simply not equipped to deal with some of the problems that we're experiencing today because they're mired in old ways of thinking. The other aspect of what's going to be happening over the next 10 years is we're also going to have an older society. So by 2050, the world's population age 60 up is going to be 2 billion. That's up 900 million in 2015. So that's nearly a doubling. And that is going to have enormous implications for societies around the world. Certainly, what we consider the modern workforce has to change. We have to create multi-stage, multi-dimensional careers that will allow people to retrain and keep working throughout their lives. Mandatory retirement at 65 is not going to work when you have 2 billion people over the age of 60. UK government at the moment is incentivizing to kind of retain, retrain, and recruit older workers, and it's good to see that some governments are pushing that agenda forward. But eventually, we all have to retire, right? We have to get off the hamster wheel. So what happens when they do? Now, sociologists and politicians and economists, they don't know, but they fall into one or two groups. Some think it's going to be a real drain on society. So as people have greater longevity and have more medical needs that are becoming more and more expensive and paying less and less in tax, it's going to drain societies, and it's going to be a real burden for the younger generation to have to support these people through taxes. The other the more hopeful set of analysts say, actually, this is going to be a huge gain to society, that having older, healthier people will be one of the best things that can happen to the world, that can happen in terms of the likelihood of going to war, the ability to help bring up children. And what's so interesting to me is it's a completely perceptual idea. If you believe that the older generation are going to contribute, then you can build a society that will make that happen and will fulfill that destiny. If you believe they're simply going to drain your system out, you can also create a system that will kind of adapt to that, but will again fulfill its own destiny. So I hope we're on the more optimistic side than the pessimistic side. And I think it's really about creating the tools and resources to cater to these big demographic shifts. And you know, that means transportation systems, that means housing. It has huge implications across every sector. Lastly, I just want to talk about augmentation, just because I think it's an interesting thing that we don't talk a lot about at the moment, but I think will be one of the big scare topics over the next 10 years. And by augmentation, what I mean is the creation of biology and technology coming together. We've already talked about how AI has revolutionized medicine, but we're getting to a point now where we can ask this question. So if we could cure every genetic disease, would we want to do it? Now, that's not a question that has really ever needed to be asked, because we've never been in the position to fulfill that answer. But today we are. We have something called CRISPR, which you may have read about. It stands for clusters of regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. So you can see why they call it CRISPR. But effectively, it allows you to edit genes, human genes, quite easily and quite cheaply, comparatively cheaply. And scientists in China have already performed what they call chemical surgery on human embryos to remove disease. And so the genie is out of the bottle, the toothpaste has been squeezed, and it's not going back in. So the technology now exists. The question is, what do we do with that? And what are the ethics really around that? So if you know anyone or related to anyone with Down syndrome, you'll know that they can lead very happy, productive, fulfilling, and loving lives. So is it a disability that we should eradicate from our gene pool? It's a difficult question, and there isn't one correct answer. But it's a question that we are going to have to grapple with over the next 10 years. And then, like almost all medical technologies, it moves from simply curing disease to improving performance, right? So what if we could use it to perhaps change the color of our baby's eyes, or perhaps make them a little taller or a little bit smarter, or maybe don't go bald, whatever it may be. And you know, instinctivly that sounds like a bad idea. You kind of know that nothing good is going to come from that. But the question is, if you could take a pill while you're pregnant to increase your child's lifespan or heighten their intelligence, would you take it? And I have to say, I think most people would. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at the market for antenatal vitamins, which is what pregnant women take to help during their pregnancy, it's a $50 billion industry in the US. And really, it doesn't have much of an effect. It only has an effect if you're suffering from malnutrition or you can't get those vitamins in some other form. So we're already buying pills that don't perform that well. So what will happen when we can buy a pill that will actually work? I think the answer is most people would take it. And that has enormous implications for society, because you don't need an ad agency to sell that pill. That pill is going to have people lined up around the block, and you can charge whatever you want for it. So ultimately, it's going to come down to money. Those who can afford to take the pill and those who can't. And that could create two different types of human being, those that have been enhanced and those that haven't. These are very difficult things that we have to wrestle with. Do we want a disease-free society? So if you could eradicate cancer or viruses or COVID-19 or flu or malaria, would you want to do it? And for a long time, we've always said yes, like Bill Gates wants to eliminate malaria. Joe Biden was told that he was going to eliminate cancer. These have all been projects by doctors and the medical profession for many years. But is it a good idea to completely eliminate disease? Economists say yes, basically because if you're sick, you can't work. And if you can't work, there's less productivity, so there's less money. But potentially we could be jinxing ourselves by creating an immune system that can't fight anything off. And that's very worrying. And actually, we're seeing some bacteria that haven't been around for hundreds of thousands of years as the polar ice caps melt. So there is a chance that a new bacteria could come in that we wouldn't have immunity to. And, you know, the big question is, do we have the right to play God when it comes to having children or disease or defects? And it's not a question that I can really answer. I do know that, you know, if you're in a very unfortunate position where you go to a doctor and you're pregnant and the doctor says, unfortunately, your child has a hole in his heart and will really only survive till the age of 3, but I have a pill that can fix it. Would you like to take the pill? Everyone is going to say yes, right? When it's down to you and your family, of course you want the medical technology to help you. But politicians have to kind of understand what are the bigger implications for society. And I think that's something we're going to be talking a lot more about as the decade moves on. So in summary, and then I think that there are a few questions, you know, from technology, think about algorithms and think about the fact that there are going to be people that can write algorithms and there are going to be people that can be controlled by algorithms, and which side would you prefer to be on? Think about automation and maybe, you know, what career you want to choose based on that. And of course, the amazing untapped potential of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We're going to see a real shift to young people and old people, because that's the way the echo boom has gone, and expect to see brands and culture catering to those two audiences. And then finally, augmentation, so this merging of biology and technology is going to become a reality. And we need to start thinking about some of those questions now so that we're better equipped to deal with creating answers as this decade progresses through to 2030. So, you know, the future is definitely here. I think the question for us all is how will we use it? And hopefully we'll use it in a very positive way. I know we have a few more minutes, and I've got a few questions that have come in over YouTube. Okay, so with the increased importance of the Gen Z audience, do you think that advertising channels will evolve to mirror the spectrum of gender identity? Yes, I do. I absolutely do. And I think it's a huge opportunity for brands to think about how they communicate, but also what they produce, because so much of what we consume is gendered. So whether it's a razor, whether it's clothing, even down to the food we eat, a lot of that has to do with gender, and it's kind of pushed. Are we talking to a male audience or a female audience? Is one of the first questions you ask when you're talking to a client. And because there's going to be much more nuance and much more fluidity around gender, I think advertising communications are going to have to reflect that. I think that was the only question that I've seen come in. So unless there's anything more, I just wanted to thank you for your time and congratulate you on your graduate show. I think our details will be up. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email, and we'll do our best to make as many responses as we can. Thank you.